Oh, it gets ingrained.
Yeah, so they go at an early age.
Yeah. Well, and when we talked about, I think maybe it was the first week, we talked about or maybe this was a Bible class, the Shema passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6.
I've heard of saying that Shema.
Yeah, our Lord is one Lord. Very important in the culture. And so I wanted to share that with you from last week's class. There will be no quiz over that. I just want to
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Yeah, it actually was kind of cool. He dresses up like a pharaoh. So here's what I would like us to cover this evening. And so far we've been talking about the idea of how did we get the Bible. And we've talked about the different types of material that were used. We talked about the way the information was copied and shared. What I want to talk about tonight is who remembers their Roman numerals? Just can you run to my office and grab black? Yeah. Who remembers their Roman numerals? If I were to say LXX, 7. All right. So there's an important piece in the development of our Bible. And so I'll start with this question. When the Apostle Paul quoted the Old Testament in his letters, what language was he quoting from?
He's a great Aramaic.
Why?
Maybe wrong. That would have been wrong, although he was Roman citizen.
What would he have quoted? What language would he have quoted?
Probably Aramaic, huh?
The language of who we were trying to be.
Okay, what would that be? Did you find it?
Well, who was he talking to?
All right.
He probably would have been talking Hebrew.
So he was Jewish. He would have known Hebrew. But what language would he have quoted from? And that was Greek.
Yeah.
Was that just the process of elimination? The test taking? It's not A, it's not A, go for C. It's always C. Oh, did you? Okay. All right. And so he would have used Greek. And so the question is why? And this is one of those studies where you learn something that you kind of knew about, and then you dig deeper and you have a greater appreciation of it. And I hope it's the same regardless of where you are in the introduction to this. But there is a book that goes by this reference, and it's called the Septuagint. Septuagint means 70. And what it is remember the library at Alexandria? It's that big famous one that burned down. Very populous. It's down here in Egypt, right? And you have a number of Jews who live in this area. And they've got the library. And the idea was that the pharaoh at the time, one of the Ptolemies, said, I want a copy of your Hebrew Bible in the language. Now, this was a time period where where Alexander the Great had spread the Greek language. Right? That Greek language becomes the predominant language of trade, of the people, of all sorts of stuff. And so there's two things happening. one, he wants a copy of the Old Testament, or a copy of their law in Greek. Also, there's the idea that, here we are in Egypt, and people aren't really reading Hebrew, aren't really speaking Hebrew. And so this is a good idea, because now we can actually put our word into the language and have something that people can use if they don't necessarily know the language. And so the legend is that Ptolemy brought down the idea of 6 Hebrew scholars from each of the tribes. There's 12 tribes. And so it's 72 translators. They all independently translated the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those first 5 books. Translated into Greek, they came together, and lo and behold, everything was the same. That's kind of the idea, the legend of it. But we do know there was a commission, give me a language, give me a Bible in the Greek language. And so they did that. And so that right there happened it began around 250 BC. Now, what's the significance about 250 years BC?
That's far down, there's nothing about.
It's that page between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? That period of time we don't know. Sometimes it'll be referred to as the intertestamental period between the testaments. Sometimes modern.
What about the books in the canon about?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
And so it's also sometimes referred to as the Second Temple period, because there was a new temple. Remember the one that Solomon had built was torn down. They raised up a new one. And that's this period of time. And so they began with the Torah. Right? This is the first 5 books. And then over the next 100 years, or 150 years, they translated the other works. This is the other books of the Old Testament that we would have, right? Now this group was Greek-speaking. And so in addition to the translations of the works, they were also writing some of their own. And so they would write their own things in Greek from their language and have all these scrolls. And they were gathered together and they codified them. Said this is the Septuagint, right? And so this work was the Old Testament for a great many Jews, because the Jews were scattered all out. Remember in Acts chapter 2, when they say, how is it that we hear every man in our own language? And they started listing all these different people from all these different areas. That the Greeks had spread out, or the Jews had spread out, and so it allowed them to have a Bible that they could read. And so, remember in Galatians where it says, in the fullness of time Christ came? And sometimes you say, well, what do you mean the fullness of time? You start looking at it, you stand back and you're like, okay. So we had a Roman Empire, which had a whole period of peace. We had Roman roads, which allowed for the free travel. We had the Greek language, so that everybody would have a universal language. You start looking at these things like, oh man, God planned everything to come together at the perfect time so it could go out.
But this time, who exactly could read? Who could read this? I mean, it wasn't just the average person. Not everyone could read this, right?
So I don't know the exact literacy rates. I know I had looked up that the Jews maybe had been kind of an outlier because synagogue worship at this time was also flourishing. And so they had communities where they would instruct their children, teach their children, and so forth. And so in terms of who could read it, I think the Jews primarily, because this would have been their scripture, but also you have the aspect of the oral reading as well. So even if you had more of a illiterate society or group, they still would have been able to have heard it spoken.
They memorized stuff.
And they memorized a lot as well.
They read it.
Yeah.
Did they read in a chant, or was it just like, what if it was just regular reading? Have you ever heard that?
Well, I do know that the kind of like when we talked about the Masoretes, where they put the little points, that in service sometimes there is like a chanter, or I think they call him a cantor, who does it. But I don't think that is the overall way that they would read it. And I say that in that when I've seen people, young boys who become men for their bar mitzvah, they read the Torah, and it's more of just a reading, not necessarily a singing. So I do that. And maybe also when Jesus, when they handed him the scroll, he would have just read it. I just had the idea that Jesus did sing, and he did jazz hands at the end. Done. This is about me. That would be the case. All right. And so here's why this idea of the Septuagint in the Greek matters. One, it would have been kind of the Bible for the early church. That when Paul writes to churches in Corinth, Galatia, Philippi, and Rome, the Old Testament copies in those churches were almost always Greek. And so they would have had those as their reference. Also, the New Testament quotes it constantly. Estimates vary, but a strong majority of Old Testament quotations in the New Testament match the Septuagint more closely than the Hebrew. Some quotes only make sense in Greek. Another reason it's important is because it bridges that 400 years of silence. There are a couple of books in the Apocrypha known as the First and Second Maccabees. I think there's actually five Maccabees, which talks about a family that was pushing back against Roman authority. And so it kind of offers kind of a historical insight into what was going on, what was believed. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that the Jews, when they were translating it into Greek, well, you got a couple things. One, so they're having to translate Hebrew examples, right? They've got a scroll. They've got a scroll that's the Hebrew. Ptolemy says, hey, I want it in Greek, right? And so they think, okay, here's the Hebrew. Okay, what would be a term in the Greek that would mean what this is kind of saying, right? So then they would translate it into Greek. So then the Jews, for at least a century or two, had a Greek term for a Hebrew concept. And so, for instance, does anybody know Christus? What is that? Christ, right? That was the term they used in the Septuagint to talk about God. And so, do you remember look at Psalm 110. Look at Psalm 110, verse 1. Somebody read that.
Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. That's an idea.
Does it have the first part, the Lord says to my Lord?
Oh. Yeah. Hey, I missed that.
Imagine it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was the quotes. I couldn't see the one.
Does
Lord
any,
says to my Lord.
all right. Now then, does anybody know where Jesus uses that? Where Jesus quotes that? You don't have to know the verse reference, but you know the story. He was tangling with the Pharisees. And in Matthew chapter 22, in verse 44, this is where he asks them a question. Oh, it's the Sadducees, sorry. Oh, no, it's the Pharisees again. In Matthew chapter 22, in verse 42, he says, "What do you think of the Christ? Whose son is he?" And they said to him, "The son of David." He said, "How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord'?" And that's Christos. And so here is the Old Testament using that term Christos to talk about God. Jesus uses that term, says, well, what is he meaning that the God said to my God? And this is where we would think that Jesus is God. There's this aspect of the Godhead. All right? So you have that idea that's already embedded in the Jewish mindset. So when Paul talks about Jesus as the Christ, the connection to the Old Testament is instantaneous for any Jew who grew up with the Septuagint, which would have been their language. And so a lot of the concepts that we think are New Testament are actually from this translation. Some of the examples I have are Christos, which is Old Testament, sometimes translated for the Anointed One. Covenant is translated as the testament and will. Glory, talking about God's glory, says Hebrew literally means the weight or the heaviness, used metaphorically for honor, reputation, or visible manifestation of God's presence. And then the Greek doxa originally meant opinion or reputation, but the Septuagint stretched that meaning to carry the full weight of the glory. So even the glory of God, or the glory of Christ, when if we were Jewish and we read it in Greek, it would remind us of the Old Testament, about God's glory.
So in Psalms, that was more of Hebrew, and in the New Testament, it's mostly Greek written. They were speaking Greek then, but they understood back to the Hebrew language. I mean, I would think they had to really figure out in Greek what those words meant in Hebrew, and they're bringing the same thing out in Matthew here. Does that make sense?
It does, and let me say something and let me know if I'm understanding correctly, right? Okay. So the Jews had this Old Testament.
In Hebrew.
Well, this is a translation
Oh, okay.
in Greek. Right? So then, Paul, when he quotes, will often use this Septuagint. And so the person who's hearing it will go back to this copy, go back to this idea. And so some of the words, like Christ, that when Paul uses Christ, so they use Christ for God, or Anointed One. And he uses it for Jesus. They would make the connection that Paul is saying that Jesus is God. Right? And so there are a number of different words that have this idea. And so God is using the language of the people to embed these concepts some 250 years before Jesus even gets here. So when Paul starts talking about Christ, or Jesus as Jesus the Christ, when they hear Christ, they're going back, if you're a Jew, you go like, oh man, really? That's something. It's like they weren't inventing words. They were using words that everybody already knew. Another reason why the Septuagint is important is that when it was done at this time period, these scholars, these Jews, were using scrolls that were very old. That for them to be able to translate it back then, they had to have some really old copies that we don't have anymore. And so what it does is, when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we found some ancient copies, it was that question, like, how accurate is this? Well, it allows us to look at, well, here's what the Hebrew is, and here's what they translated from. And you begin to see there's a lot of commonality, that it wasn't necessarily made up of whole cloth. And so it's a window into the older Hebrew copies, an older way of saying, okay, what are some of the early things they had, because that's how they translated things.
Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls translate all the word for word.
I want to say yes.
Pretty sure it is.
Now there is one significant one that I want us to look at, and this is kind of cool. If you will, turn to Isaiah 7:14. Isaiah 7, verse 14. All right, and what's it say?
Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a son. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel.
All right. Does anybody's translation have young woman or maiden? Nobody's? Okay. So this is one of those things where in the Hebrew, the word will be all, and it means young woman. In the Greek, I don't know, I can't spell the word, but it means virgin, right? I'll write that there. Okay. All right. Young woman, virgin, right? Is there a difference between those two? You're like, there may be. Could be. Depends on the culture. And so, he is, so I didn't get there yet. Look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. Sorry.
Mine thing, I got a little side note, is that the Hebrew is plural of young women.
Okay.
Matthew what?
Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. And actually, will somebody read verse 22 first?
So all this was done that it might be fulfilled
And so, Isaiah 7:14, and then this is Matthew 1:23, right? And so if you look at some Hebrew manuscripts, you would see the translator woman, right? Which young woman, maid. Greek, virgin, right? Specific. And so you have those two things. You're basing your whole thing based on this prophecy, right? The virgin shall give birth. What term do you think the Jews, when they were translating the Septuagint, what term do you think they used? And so they looked at the manuscript, and even if it said Alma, they said, yes, it technically means young woman, but in the context. In the context, it means virgin. And so they used that Greek term. And so when Matthew comes around, he's quoting, saying, here's this prophecy that was way back when about Jesus. And so there are a couple of places where the Septuagint gives us insight into how these Jews in the 250 BC time period, how they were reading their scripture, how they were interpreting it. Because when they're making a translation, they want it to be as accurate as possible. Because this isn't just a side job, this is a continuation of their belief system. And so he did that. I'm poor on my timing. We get out at 7:30, 7:45. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next point, but I have a couple more of those if you're interested in it. And so now back to kind of like John's question about the Apocrypha. And so if you look at the Septuagint, it has the Torah. It has the prophets. It has the history. It has the writings. It basically has, like our English Bibles are broken down the way the Septuagint is in terms of the book order. But they also included these other writings. This is like, maybe you've heard of these, Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach. Do those sound familiar? So, in the Septuagint, it was a collection of not only the law, but also these other writings. And so they put them in this one thing. And the way I was thinking about it, a couple of ways, is, has anybody seen like an old Bible where someone actually filled in the marriage, the deaths, those pages? Or seen an old Bible and they've got it stuffed with bulletins or obituaries or stuff like that, right? That if you were to look at that Bible, you would say, okay, here's the word, and then here's this extra stuff. This extra stuff is good. It helps you know, helps you see what was going on at the time, it helps you put it in context, but you don't necessarily say, this is part of the Word of God. And so, even though they put it in the Septuagint, they never considered it part of the canon, part of the inspired word, right?
How
Even
do we know that? Considered part of the inspired word.
I think that we would say in terms of, well, I guess the question would be is like from whose perspective? In terms of the apostles never quote those other books. In terms of being, I don't think they quote those extra things. It's usually all just the canon. Also, in terms of, I want to say Josephus, when he lists the books, he references the typical canon that we would have. And so I can get more information in terms of laying out.
Well, the reason I ask is, well, I know the Catholic Church
Includes. Yeah. All right, so I'm getting it. Okay. So that's the Greek, right?
Yeah.
So when we start getting down into the different translations and so forth, and the history of how each one influenced the other, when you go down here, you have this guy named Jerome, who translated the Septuagint into Latin. And he was, I don't know if you would say pressured, but he was called to include the other books.
And who's Jerome?
I know he translated Septuagint. I don't know if he was maybe a priest. I forget what his, maybe a bishop. Does anybody know? Look up Jerome, was he a priest or a bishop? But he translated into the Latin, that included in it. And so when the King James Version was done, a lot of it was based on Jerome's Bible, which then included those other writings. Now what Jerome did is he said, these are the books, what we would say the 39. These are canonical. These are actually part of the canon. The other ones are ecclesiastical. He said, here, these, I'll translate these, but they're not like the others. The ecclesiastical ones, the Apocrypha, is more for just encouragement, edification, good information, gives you insight into the history. And so he put that, so he made a distinction between the two. And that even when the early King James was translated,
They were here too.
yeah, they were in it too. But I want to say there was like a notation from the translators kind of highlighting his division between the two.
It actually says here that he translated both the Old and New Testament, but his primary reason was to take the Old Testament back to Hebrew for greater accuracy. Is that true?
I did it say the
It said that Jerome shifted from translating the Old Testament via the Greek to using Hebrew for more greater accuracy for the original text.
Oh, that would be interesting. I just know that he translated the.
Yeah, Old and New Testament.
Okay.
So there, in that middle step, there was multiple people working under Jerome to do the translations.
It was the standard Bible for the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But one guy doing it, there's errors, just like you said in the verse, so is there, he's not the only one translating this.
I generally it's referred to as his translation, so I don't know if he had scribes
I bet he had helpers.
or had some sort of way of.
It says it's called St. Jerome's Bible.
Yeah, I mean, it says, and so his connection to there is to the Septuagint. And so then when the King James uses his, it includes it. And then I have a reference.
If I'm not mistaken, Martin Luther is the one that took those 7 books out of the Bible that we're in today.
He may have one of the ones because there was an idea that I wrote it down, at the Council of Trent, this is 1611, was King James, in 1546, you had the Council of Trent, which they canonized the Apocrypha. Where they said, okay, Tobit, all these things, we're going to keep those, and the Catholic Church, we're going to keep those and claim those as inspired, even though historically they never were, as far as I can see. And so that's kind of the reason why they're in.
Well, that's what I'm not trying to give you trouble.
No.
I'm just trying to figure out how, when, and by whom were they to judge not to be as important as the rest of the Bible.
So you're wondering
Why they were taken out.
why they were taken out or why they were put in?
No, that's why, yeah, why they were set aside is not being as important as the rest of the books.
So I would say that this period right here, that there was an action of,
But somebody made that ultimate decision.
The extra books didn't fit in with the timeline of when the original stuff was right, even the New Testament, it came years after.
No, it came before, after the Old Testament and before Jesus came.
okay,
Spencer did like a class, but there was a,
Like you said, there was 300 years there where they were almost silent.
yeah. All right. So you end with Malachi, right? Malachi says there's going to be a silence. And so even though they're writing these additional books in Greek, there's an understanding that it's too early, not too early, that they're written too late to be part of the original canon.
Yeah, we decided that. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I thought there was, see, like we heard this story before, there was a group of biblical scholars that came together and decided that those other books were not inspired by God.
Well, and so that could be the idea of the 70 who came together. But what you're talking about in terms of canonization, how do we decide? And it wasn't like somebody said, I want this one, I don't want this one. But more the idea of, okay, everybody empty your pockets. And then people would pull out, I've got this copy, this copy, this copy, this copy. And we'd say, okay, everybody's got this one copy and this one person has something that's completely different. Like, okay, that's odd. We don't think that's part of it. So I don't think that's as cogent an answer that you're wanting.
It's not.
But does this make sense as to how it got included? That it was with the Septuagint, Jerome translated it, included it, and that was the basis of the King James. And because it was in Jerome, they accepted it, canonized it, and then they translated it. And then, I forget what year it was, where the King James, let's see. I don't have the date for when it was out. But you could probably realize that when the King James, you had the kind of a conflict between kings and popes and commissioning a new Bible in the language of people. But does this make sense in terms of how it got in? And then I can work on a way of explaining.
This is what I just looked it up.
Okay.
It says the canon of the Bible was not decided by one person or a single council, but rather recognized through the historical process involving early Christian churches, councils, and scholars, largely finalized by the late 14th century. Key councils include the Council of Rome, the Council of Hippo, and the Council of Carthage, which confirmed the 27 books of the New Testament.
And whereas that is accurate, there's a kind of a tendency to say that they were the final decision, whereas what they were doing is recognizing historically this has already been decided. Because
I'm kind of like you, I don't think those books historically were parallel to the canon, and that was a problem.
and so I'll work on a better way of explaining it.
I've read all those books several times, and I don't think they fit either. I'm just trying to get a feel for who made all these decisions.
And I think that's the idea, is that there was not one person deciding as much as the organic nature of God using this. Because this is kind of the thing I took away with the Septuagint, is in the New Testament, they're making a lot of claims about who Jesus is, right? And let me put it this way. Let's say that you have a political party that has a belief system, right? And they've got an opposing political party. And the opposing political party says, we found examples in your writings that purport something much different than what you believe. And these people say, well, who translated it? Like, oh, we translated it. Like, so you took my stuff, you translated it in your own language, and it goes with what you believe. And they're like, yeah. You're like, no, that doesn't work that way, right? You're like, that's not how it works. I'm not going to believe you. But what God did is he had the Jews translate the Hebrew language into Greek for 250 years. So that when Paul, Mark, Luke, when they're quoting the Old Testament, they're quoting how they translate it. They're not making anything up. I'm just saying what you said. And so it takes away that idea of like, well, you're manipulating our language. No, I'm using what you did, that you accepted. I'm using your own writings. And I think that's just, I mean, like if you're playing chess, that's just brilliant, right? You just took away a potential argument that they would use because you've already established it 250 years. So that when Paul talks about the Christ or about glory, they instantly know that it goes back to the law.
I wonder if our Catholic Church kept those books.
It says here, it says, there's a Jewish canon. The Old Testament canon was generally accepted for Jewish traditions before the Christian era, later affirmed by the church. Ministers for Protestant reformers such as Luther accepted the same New Testament canon, but separated the Apocrypha, focusing on 39 books of the Hebrew Old Testament.
Yeah.
So I think, that's how it was separated.
Well, why did the Catholic Church keep that?
So in the Apocrypha, there are some of the books that support Catholic doctrine.
Yeah, because originally I guess Jerome, it was a Catholic. It was used as a Catholic Bible.
Yeah, the Jerome Bible, yeah, the Latin Vulgate.
So that's what that.
They
And-
call him the doctor of the church.
Say again?
Jerome is called the doctor of the church of the Catholic tradition.
Yeah.
That's why they did.
And so because it supports some of the doctrine, I know one in particular is like purgatory and stuff like that. I think that may be one of the reasons.
My daughter's mother-in-law, father-in-law, Catholic, and he brought those books down when he took Greek. And I started reading and just got so mixed up, I had to pull out and start over.
And one of the ones we're going to talk about is kind of the canonization. How was it decided? Oftentimes it was who is the author purported to be? Is it an apostle or someone near an apostle? How universal is the book itself? How does it fit in regards to the overall teaching in general? So there are several different things that we have seen. How do we recognize when something has been, as Paul says, God inspired? But I wanted to share about the Septuagint because of its importance.
The other thing that I just can't get quite straight in my mind is we talk about all this Greek language. What about the Aramaic? From what I understood, that's what Jesus and the Jews spoke in every day was Aramaic.
I had heard that as well. I do know that there are certain portions of the New Testament. I think when he cries out, Eli, Eli, I think that is
So that movie
Aramaic.
that Mel Gibson made, the whole language. is
Aramaic. And so I don't know. I've heard the same thing. I haven't seen kind of the evidence for it. But it shouldn't be odd for us to think of a people who speak multiple languages. You know, as American, that joke, you know, what do you call a person who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. Person who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. Person who speaks 1 language? American.
Yeah.
Right? But if you go over to Europe,
They speak 5 and 6.
they speak 5 or 6 languages. And so if they spoke Aramaic as a common tongue, I could see that. The Koine Greek was supposed to be kind of the language of the people as well.
And I find it odd that there, under Roman rule, Greek would have been the main language.
Yeah. Well, Alexander had the benefit of that because he had spread so wide that when Rome took over his territory, there was already a language. Now,
Oh, yeah.
Latin was kind of the Senate, kind of the language of the law, if you will, but Greek still had a huge purpose in it as well.
You know, when I first saw the sheet of paper, I was looking at this side, and I thought,
You're like, oh, just had a
The
stroke.
printer wasn't working,
no,
right?
I thought it was Muslim type language.
Oh, no.
But when you see their language, it looks a lot like this.
Yeah, it's definitely like a flowy.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, I think we talked last time about it, Greg Shorthand. It's kind of like a collection of that. All right, and so that is kind of the Septuagint and its import in terms of how we got the Bible, right? It was kind of this culmination of God's providence, bringing His truth into a language that would then spread out. So that way, when Jesus says in the story of rich man and Lazarus, where the guy says, go send, if someone from the dead comes back, my brothers will repent. He says, no, they've got Moses and the prophets we read every day. They're not going to believe them. They're not going to believe one comes back from the dead. The Septuagint was being read in synagogues, being read in places. Let me double check on the synagogue. I think it is, but going out all the way. And this is also an interesting thing to say, because sometimes people will say, well, you're using a translation, right? You've got the English translation. How do you know what the original was? It's like, here are the apostles quoting from a translation, because it was a faithful rendering of what was being said. So that kind of gives us the idea that God's interested in His message going out, not necessarily the particular language it is translated in, as long as it's faithful. This kind of stands out because if you start getting into Muslim apologetics, they will say unless it's an Arabic, unless it's an Arabic, it's not a true rendition. And so that's kind of a contrast. So next week, I will see if I can find some more stuff, John, on that as well. And then we'll start looking at either how the decisions were made, or we'll look more at this kind of timeline of how things were done, especially when we've got so many different variations now.
Why do we have so many?
When was the last time you said superfluity of naughtiness? Right? We don't use that word. And so, oftentimes translations similar to Jerome, similar to the King James, it was the idea is like, well, we want this information is so good, we want it in the language of the people so they can understand it. And so a lot of times translators said, okay, well, we recognize some people have different backgrounds, different understandings, and so they translate it in different languages. And so even in English, you can say something at a high end, high vocabulary, high register, or you can do it in slang, right? And the idea is, can you say it in a way that still faithfully carries the information? And so that's one of the reasons. And if we really wanted to get into the weeds, we could start asking the questions about how a lot of places are now copyrighting, and what kind of implications that has. But we don't have to get into that. That's just, if you want to come over during office hours and just make some coffee and just chat. But I think us in terms of appreciating what God has done so that we have confidence in what we read. Right. Do we have time for 2 questions?
Have a comment. It, to me, makes it more realistic hearing, in the New Testament, quote of the Old Testament, because that makes it more, real, that what was in the Old Testament is true. And so, and they were, I think you said last week there was like 5,800 writers. And
Or manuscripts and
so
evidence.
we have all these, Jesus' word is spreading so much in the New Testament. I mean, everybody was so excited
Yeah.
about Christ, and they were just telling all that. So, you know, to know the word and to be in the New Testament written, to be so much easier to understand too than the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah. When you think that the Bible is the most translated book in history, or that it's the most best-selling,
It's so more copies.
Than anything? You begin to realize, like, God's invested in His Word, not being stopped. Anybody know I'll end with this, the French philosopher Voltaire? He was anti-Christianity, you know, and then he ends up dying, and then I forget which Bible publishing place bought his house and started printing the Bible out of it. But there's the idea that mankind has attempted to stop the spread of His Word, but it goes on unabated.
I think one of the biggest, I can't call it a thrill, but one of the biggest things I ever picked up over my older age was the fact that Jesus was crucified on Passover week, and He was the ultimate lamb. I mean, He had that way back in Egypt, Passover. They had it every year since, all the way up to the time.
Oh, yeah.
They still have it.
Very
But
much so.
He was the ultimate lamb, without limit.
And we only know that because we got the Old Testament. We can able to see, we use that reference. Just have we close out prayer?